Hello, welcome to round 6 of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. This is a match between Mugwort, myself, the commentator, and xuanet from Spain, or xuanet as Yasuo would say. Just about to start. This match was played a couple of weeks ago from the time of recording the audio, so I may forget everything. In fact, this match was played quite late in the evening for me, after midnight, so the next day I pretty much forgot all the games because they were not exactly as expected, except for game 1. So this is pretty much mainline theory with an early d5 pawn sacrifice. White has 3 main captures on d5. And xuanet plays bishop takes. So here you can try and win the bishop back with pawn at e6 using the pin along the d-file. Knight at c6 is a very unusual move, but it's well known, it's been played many times. It's quite a forcing line. White will trade queens, put the pawns on b7 and c7. Black will just abandon the rook on d8. I mean, there's not really any choice, and go for counterplay. Bishop's very useful on d4 because it also protects the castled king in case of a later pawn at h6 from white. So black is some material down, but the main thing is that castling will always be safe, and try and exploit the weaknesses on f2 and also g2, f3. So white has a big choice. Will usually place either the rook or queen on to defend f2. And I think the move against rook at d2 is pawn at f3. Trying to get into g2 quickly. And if queen at g2, queen at f1, let's say, then take back on f3, threatens pawn at g2. Something like this. Could even perhaps take on c3 first, just to avoid the bishop being on pre-later. Now, I did not know this at the time of the match, so I went for something the finisher played against me once, which was queen at b6. So just keeping an eye on that passed pawn on b7, and also a sensitive square c6, protecting the bishop, and potentially threatening bishop takes f2, check at the right time. Also, there's a subtle threat of bishop takes c3 and pawn at b2. I may not want to do that with the d-file open, but it's an idea to keep in mind for later in some lines. So after a long think, the move is going to be 17, queen at b6. And white here has a big choice. If he castles, I'd probably change to the light squares with pawn at h3. He could put on the queen for defense, he could put the pawn on e3. So this is a safe approach by treading the rook back for the bishop, putting the bishop back on e3. And the game is still very much in the balance. Not that it's a symmetrical position at all, but both sides have their advantages and disadvantages. So here, surprisingly, the best move is just to ignore the queen on pre and go for it, throw everything into the attack with pawn at h3, and then h takes g2 and knight f3 is the big threat. I played the moves in the wrong order because I'm looking into knight at f3 with the idea of making a hole on g2, pawn at g2, rook at h1, but actually this is the wrong way to do it because there's a good defense which was actually missed in the game after pawn at g2, queen at g1. And then even if I capture the rook on h1, queen takes back, and that covers the hole on g2. So I don't really have any big threats. The queen is still hanging on d4. And probably just have to move it back, and then white will take over the initiative. So this is not the most accurate move, knight at f3 check. So xuanet should simply capture the knight and then queen at g1. But in the game, I think he played king e2. and must have missed my reply, which was knight at g1. There's actually a forced mate after knight at g1. Because I always have the pawn at e2 if I need it, deflecting the knight away from d1, and then the heavy piece on d1 or e1 will mate. So it means he has to sack the rook, but then I have two heavy pieces which will mate very quickly, as we're about to find out. So perhaps xuanet just overthought king e2, and if he was playing a 1 minute game, sometimes you play better moves just on instinct. Take the knight, defend. I'm not necessarily sure that he missed the defense. Maybe he just missed this move, knight at g1, because without this I have some problems. Two pieces hanging. And the point is here that two heavy pieces will mate with a decoy over to e1 and then rook at d1. So just enough pieces in hand to mate. So that's game one. Let's move on, taking the white pieces in the first game. Not sure what to expect. xuanet often plays random openings, different in every game with the black pieces. So he's gone for a Zhang Li setup with an early knight c6. There are several ways that white can play against this. Bishop c4, bishop b5, or you can thrust an early d5, which is what happened in the game. You can play more quietly with bishop e3, bishop e2, castle kingside. You can throw in the move h3 to stop bishop g4. So that's at least 5 different ways to play. And black will often, if bishop b5, not even castle, and play king f8. So I'm almost tempted to play bishop c4 and go for the sack on f7. xuanet is one of the most aggressive players in Crazyhouse. He's been dubbed the Mikhail Tal of Crazyhouse. Always trying to get on the offensive, even from what seemingly a passive position, can turn things around very quickly with enough trades of pieces. And just watching again the match between Jasugi99 and Bugzilla, which I commentated on a few weeks ago. Sometimes Jasugi will give up a piece for a pawn like this, just to make sure his defenses are intact, and then when the trades come, then we see a fierce counterattack. Now, knight at e5 was an interesting move there instead of pawn to e5. The same idea, try and bust open the d file, and with targets also of c6 and f7, so knight at e5 was a slight improvement. A little bit hard to see, non-intuitive move. But trading on d6 is okay. I just want to develop the bishop and castle. Now the knight on g4 is not so threatening after castle's kingside. Assuming black will do the same, because the knight on g4 also helps to slow down the attack on h6 and g7. Some players will use the two pawns in hand as black to defend. Pawn at d5, pawn at e6, pawn at h6, something like this. But no, this is not xuanet style. And as we're about to see, he will attack with pawn at b4. So, of course, hoping for knight e4, then he can play d5. Knight e2 is a little bit awkward. We might see a move like pawn at e4, kicking the other knight away. Or even d5 first. So, after the move pawn at b4, I think the correct response is to go for the counterattack with knight g5, which is what happened in the game. Because I have some ideas of blocking out the bishop on c8 and putting a pawn on e6. Or maybe sacking the knight or the bishop first and then pawn at e6. I'm not quite sure about the move order yet, but the idea is to attack on the light squares f7, e6 and to try and block out the bishop on c8. If I had two pawns in hand, I could even think about deflecting the bishop away with pawn at b7. I'm not sure I want to do that right now because I'd rather keep the pawn in hand for e6 or f7 or h6 depending on what happens. So we're spending a long time in the opening. It's an unknown position after about 6 moves. And it was similar to all my games against Master Tan. We're both out of book after 6 moves in every game. So if I had another move, I'm still not entirely sure. Probably knight takes f7, but pawn at e6 is worth considering too. So I think because I've got 2 pieces hanging, I have to take on f7 with something. It doesn't make any sense to go backwards. So I think this is alright. Bishop takes f7. Perhaps I should take the rook immediately. I'm really not sure what the best move is here. Pawn on e6 I'm not so sure because you can sack the bishop and keep f7 safe. Can even leave the queen on pre and take some pieces back and then counterattack with pawn at f3. So I don't think this pawn at e6 is the right move, move 13. But yeah, if knight takes f7, the knight from e5 can come back to recapture, then it's still defending the key square h6, so again, I'm not exactly sure what the best play is after that. Perhaps then I can do pawn at b7 and knight at e6, something like that, to get in on the dark squares, g7. So he's giving me a choice to take the queen, but I'm actually more tempted to take the bishop because taking the queen, he'll recapture with the rook, and then I'm still a long way from getting in on g7. I can always bring the knight back to e6 and threaten knight at h6 check. Because I certainly don't want to leave the knight on g7, it's just in the way of the attack. But he can defend with pawn or bishop at g7. And this will really slow down the white attack. And there's no way to stop him getting in on g2. He's also threatening moves like knight at e2 check and even pawn at e2. So this is a tricky move too, queen f8. If I take it, again, I'm a long way from attacking. So knight at h6, he can just take that. I'm not threatening anything in one move, so f takes g2, extremely dangerous. And in fact, I think I should be losing from here. I shouldn't have any defense against knight at f3, knight at h4, and so on. Knight to h4, I think even better. Because he should save the other knight for f5, which is what happens. But not easy to see the mate. After pawn f6, it does block the f-file, king f4. It was an incredible mate missed with pawn at g5, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, then knight to d3. Very, very hard to see, even with a minute or 2 on the clock. Clearing the square e5, and then there was a pawn mate to follow. A very difficult mate in 5, missed by xuanet. Both players missed it in the game. But I think I played well from here because the bishop on g2 is always hanging. There's no checking sequence that leads to mate. And yeah, I've taken over the back row and it's mate in 1. Bishop at g7 or h5. Alright, so crazy time scramble there. I just survived with the king out on g3. And xuanet has already mixed up the openings in game number 3. He's gone for a d4 setup. Seems like a lot of players are doing this against me. Chicken, Jasugi, I don't think Bugzilla played any d4s. And who else? Master 10, maybe one game. Oh, Penguin also used d4 quite well. Alright, so this is rather unique with bishop b5 and capture on c6 early. Quite happy with this opening though as black. I usually don't get such activity. So I should trade on e5 because I have multiple weaknesses on c6 and g4. And it's very thematic that a knight is the best piece for white on e5. So because that pin, he hasn't blocked it out already, I should be attacking with a move like knight at h4 and just abandoning the pawn on g7, go for the counter-attack on g2. F6 is okay because if he piles up on c7, then I can take on e5. I'm trying to make him waste time by going backwards. I know this is not xuanet style. I didn't really think moves like knight g5 would work. There's too many squares for the king. So bishop at b7 makes some sense. I think I should forget about the rook and just defend c6. Nothing wrong with playing knight e7 immediately. But I decided to throw in a check first. Yeah, it was my first thought to play knight e7, but decided to play a bishop check on a5. It's not always very useful. I could do without the bishop check, I think. Just helps him develop knight c3, but at least both the knights are pinned. If I have time to play knight at e4, I would do so. If I had a pawn for a3, that would be good. Or a bishop for b4. But yeah, knight e7 is essential here. I don't mind if he picks off the rook on a8. It's not doing very much. But also another idea of the bishop on a5 is to cover the square c7, so just in case the queen is not defending the pawn on c7. So he's got h3. I think nothing wrong with just taking on f3 and putting the knights on to harass the queen. But yeah, bishop h5 again, nothing wrong with this either. So if I have time, I would like to do many things here. Knight at h4, knight at e4 perhaps. Rook b8 is good, taking the bishop on e5. Castling also looks safe. So I have many good ideas here, and I'm quite happy enticing white to play g4 because, of course, there are more holes around the king side, as well as this potential weakness on c3 with knight at e4. So yeah, I don't usually get such a good position with the black pieces in d4 openings. It's very rare. But g5, I could probably just ignore that and castle, or take the bishop is okay. Alright, should I bother checking on g2? I could put a bishop on g2 if I want. I could just castle. I think the most accurate move after king f1 is actually to sack the knight on e3, check, and then castle with check. But yeah, it's okay to bring the knight back to h4 followed by castles. So of course I'm happy if he gives me a pawn on d7, I'll just take it and go pawn at g2 check. But yeah, now the black king is very safe, and the only way for white to attack is with moves like pawn at h6 or pawn at f6, and then by trading a couple of pawns, maybe a rook or a knight would be useful eventually. But he's a long way from a mate, so I like this trading on c3 because then the idea is knight at e4. Could even sack the rook on f2 and then knight at e4. There are a lot of holes to take advantage of around the white king side. Now this b3 is obviously a slip, but during all the championship games my takebacks are off, so I don't have to think about a takeback under any circumstances. That's not even on the table. But even if b takes c3, yeah, a rook at f2 check was the best move. Even a build-up move like knight at e4 is also very strong. So I think black has a winning advantage in any case. has resigned after the slip. Okay, good start from Mugwort 3-0, 3-love. We've seen a different opening altogether with d5, knight f6, and then an early a6. So I think it's good to support the pawn with bishop c4 because it means it's a real gambit. There's no way he can get the pawn back. I don't really think he wants to play b5 and b4. But I have never seen this triple pawn gambit, allowing e takes f7 check. Just wondering what the safest way is. It's thematic to give a pawn back with d4 and then perhaps just go for it with pawn at h6, use the bishop on c1 for support. I don't think bishop takes f2 check is that dangerous. I can even trade queens take back with the knight, bring the king to f1, the knight covers f2. And white is the one with all the threats. And this is okay, pawn at g5, but knight h3 is definitely a mistake. Because when the knight moves out of the way from g4, then he's threatening bishop takes h3. So probably just the simple knight f3 was much better. So I'm kicking myself at playing a couple of dubious moves in a row. And I don't have an easy way out. And when I say a way out, I mean a way for xuanet not to gain some sort of initiative or compensation for the pawns that he's dropped. Because also the pawn on g5 is dropping after bishop takes h3. Yeah, I'm really not sure what the best move is here. d4 opens up the bishop on c1, but it's not really that much of a factor at the moment. Maybe bishop d5, at least it covers the light squares like g2, but it is dropping the pawn on g5. And of course then I can bolster the light squares with bishop at g2. This is not xuanet style, and it's actually a very dangerous queen sack. Queen takes d5, knight at f3 check. I think king f1 is forced. But the idea is that bishop at c4 can be answered. Oh, that will be the response to any king move on the light squares. So I've given xuanet a big chance with bishop takes f3. It was much stronger to play bishop takes f3 than knight takes f3, move 15. And then it's very difficult to defend g2 and e2 at the same time. I'll have to give a lot of material back. He's got the initiative as well. But this move doesn't seem to carry a big threat as long as I defend the square g2. So for example, just putting a bishop back on g2, and then the knight on f3 actually gets in the way. Because if he takes a pawn with check, it's only going to help me defend with the queen on d2 or the rook on h2, for example. So it looks like he's missed this fork with knight at d7. It's a bit of a sloppy game from both players, I have to say. There's been a lot of tactical misses. This one too, queen h5 check. Queen takes g5. And there are so many ideas. Queen takes d5, of course. Queen at d7, possibly. And I like this next move. Maybe it's not the fastest way to mate, but using the pin along the fifth rank with bishop takes e4. He can't take with the bishop because of the response queen at e6 check and knight d7. And this way I'll just save the bishop with bishop back to d3. A new bishop at d3 was also fine. And we have a force mate with knight at h6, so just deflecting the pawn away from f6, and queen at f6 is a quick mate. Okay, it's gone out to 4-love. So it seems like Xuanet's kind of loose tactical style suits the way I play. He can be extremely dangerous when he gets the initiative and there's no counter-attack against him. He doesn't like to play slowly and defend. I mean, a bit like me, but I think he's only going for these d4, d5 setups to avoid those theoretical lines with an e4, e5 and an early bishop e7. I don't think knight f6 is correct here. I think either bishop b4 or even trading the pawns first on e4 and then bishop b4. It's a bit of a funny position, so I'm going for a queen h4 check, but I'd rather wait till he pushes f4. Yeah, I think knight c6 is good. Perhaps he should be playing knight h3 or bishop d3 first before f4, because this check is rather nasty. It looks like the pawn on f4 is dropping, and g3, of course, I can go knight takes g3 and queen takes h1. So I think black should have a big advantage. I'm giving up the knight on purpose. There's queen takes h5, but then many good options here, including pawn at d2 check, knight takes d4, pawn at e3 is also good, which happened in the game. Queen takes g3 check is really interesting, and bishop at d2, knight takes d4, stuff like this. Wasn't quite sure whether to put the pawn on with check, or whether I should just move the queen away, queen b4. He does have knight at d3 defending everything, and gaining a tempo on the queen. I think nothing wrong with putting a pawn on check first, just to stop castle's queenside, which happened later on in the game. But there's a really interesting move after queen b4, knight at d3 missed in the game. Didn't really consider the possibility. But I'm sure somebody like Opperweisen or Jasugi would find the move quickly after knight at d3. So the most obvious moves will be queen a5 or queen b6 to preserve the queen. But there's another option here with pawn at a3. That's a fascinating move, sacking the queen and not even taking on b2 yet. Just go bishop takes b4, keep the pin. And then it's very difficult for white to deal with the threat of a takes b2. You're even allowing the sack on f7 with knight g5 coming. You can bring the king back to e8 and d8, and black is safe. So yeah, amazing move. Pawn at a3 missed. Alright, but the game has continued. Queen b6, castle's queenside. I can castle queenside also at any time, but I'd rather try to attack first. Pawn at a3 is the obvious move. Also looking into moves like knight b4. But I thought this isn't really attacking. It's not the color that I want to attack. I do want to deflect the knight on d3 away from b2, but I don't think this is the best way to do it. Yeah, so the simple move, pawn at a3 is good, bishop takes a3, pawn at b2. So now, I think I went a little bit overboard in the attack with bishop takes b2 check. I mean, the idea is obvious, attack with brute force on the dark squares, but I think a better way to do this would be to start by playing d4 on move 16. So, and then the bishop sack is a really serious danger with pawns coming in on c3 and d2. And b2 rather. Yeah, this is not the most accurate way to proceed, but still quite decent for black. Again, d4 is the most obvious move, but this is, again, I mean, I'm forcing him to play a good move. Just knight ba4, queen's hanging again. So yeah, what else? Just queen a5, trying to move it somewhere where it can't be harassed. Not entirely sure what to do next. Maybe castle's queenside. Idea to unleash the bishop on d7 by playing knight b4. And take on a4, then knight takes a2 check becomes a possibility. So I don't mind him taking on g7 because I can always castle queenside. I think knight b4 is good. Just got to make sure if I do castle that he doesn't have a rook for a8 and a knight for e7, which would be a smothered mate. But no, he hasn't taken on g7, he's on bishop at b3. Castle queenside anyway, I think is good. So we're almost all out of pieces. And the plan is simply to take on a4. Now, the bishop on b3 does help to defend the square a2. But we'll see how he wants to recapture after bishop takes a4. Rook takes b4, pawn at b2 check I think is good because there are always ideas of promoting the pawn. Now I should immediately focus on the most important thing, which is the knight on c3 defending the promotion square. And before he has time for a move like bishop takes a4, which opens up the rook to defend b1, I should be playing a move like knight at e4. It's a key move in attacking knight at e4. So also threatening queen takes b4, interfering along the fourth rank. And if knight takes e4, there's also promotion check, but the idea to open up the d file with d takes e4 would check as well. So it's absolutely crushing move, knight at e4, move number 23. I mean, still okay, bishop takes b3. Bishop b5 opens up the first rank. Yeah, running short on time. Again, knight at e4 was the move. Or d4, interfering again on the fourth rank. A bishop at c4 check. There's no need to sack the queen. I'm just going crazy with the sacks. Completely unnecessary. The rook on h1 defending the promotion, you can see. Yeah, it's a very timely counter sack because I don't quite have enough. Queen defends some of the key squares around the king. And now white is on the attack if I take the queen. So I'm not sure whether this counter sack was necessary, but I think I have one more chance in this game. After knight takes pawn at e3 is good. And the move simply is queen at e4. I didn't notice queen takes e2 check afterwards. I'm just trying not to get flagged, but now I've given white the checks. And a fascinating move here. Coming up, sack on e7 just to continue the checking sequence. I'm not sure whether it was necessary, just knight at c5. Surely would be good enough because he has knight takes d4 check. It's probably the move he missed before the queen sack. He's just buying a little bit of time. But yeah, I'm going to get mated very soon. There's no way I can survive this. Yeah, that's it, mating one. Alright, so good finish from xuanet, but I had so many opportunities. I mean, I really should never lose that game after castle's queenside and pawn at a3. And so many chances to continue the attack on the dark squares with moves like d4 and knight at e4 at the right time, as mentioned before. Alright, bit of a shame. 4-1. Let's keep going. Game number 6. Again, I didn't think xuanet would repeat this, but perhaps since I played so badly in game number 4, then he has repeated the same triple pawn gambit. I mean, so many pawns. Surely there's a way to just build a wall and keep all the pieces out. So I tried pawn at e3 last game. Nothing wrong with pawn at e3, but playing d4 is, as I mentioned before, much more thematic, and It's a way to counterattack on h6 very quickly. Now queen e2 is also okay. Pretty much any move is okay. I'm just inviting black to sack on f2 because he doesn't have any pieces in hand. Yeah, so this is inviting black to go knight d4 and knight takes e2, but this is actually exactly what I'm playing for, because I'm going to try and pick up 2 knights in the process and also take on g7 with check and draw the king out. And perhaps ideas like pawn at h6 and d4 with check. But the king is very safe after knight d4 and knight takes e2. Also had the idea of pawn at e7, drawing the bishop back to e7, and then that avoids any sack on f2. Maybe I'm just worried too much about being attacked and I shouldn't worry and just go for it. So not really sure what else. I mean, maybe he can play... No, he's worried about if the knight moves anywhere, queen e8 check is too strong. Trading queens, vacating the square f7. So here's what I was talking about before. And the most obvious move is just f takes g7 check and then recapture the knight on e2. And I really don't think the sack on f2 is dangerous, but just in case, I'll draw the bishop back to e7 and then take on g7. So then it looks like the only way he can counterattack is via g2, so I'm expecting pawn at h3 or pawn at f3 in response. Because the only knight check I have is h5. I mean, there's also the possibility to go knight at e8 check. But after rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, I'm giving black a lot of pieces if I want to play rook at g8 check, and then he'll sack the queen there and try to counterattack. But I suppose it's possible to go knight at e8 check straight away. But I thought, I mean, if we trade on g2 and he goes queen at h1, I always have rook to g1 in response. Just as long as I don't lose a knight straight away for f3, I think I should be safe. So yeah, after the capture on g2, I don't think it's combining very well with knight at e8 check. I'd rather go for the pawn drop on h6 by playing d4 after rook takes d2 check. So I'm looking at the move of d4. And then if he drops a pawn on f3, for example, then I start looking at forced checking sequences, starting with pawn at h6 check. So I almost played knight at e8 check, and then I realized, hang on a minute, I'm giving him the piece that he wants for f3. So unless this leads to a forced mate, and I don't think it does, it's not a very good idea. So much better in the short term to just avoid the trades and play d4, I think is correct. And there's nothing to fear if he doesn't have a knight in hand on queen at h1 check and rook g1. And you notice any sack on g1, knight takes g1, also the bishop helps to defend f1 in case that may be important. So pawn at g5 blocks out the bishop on c1. So I could try to build a diagonal chain starting with pawn at e5. That's what happened in the game. Obvious ideas of pawn at f6, take, queen takes, and knight at h5 check. So because if he ever takes back with the king, then I get the first attack. So I've noticed in the camera I've adopted a finger on the nose posture. But usually when I get absorbed into the game too much, I'm totally unaware of how I look on the camera or whether I'm front and center. I think it's now a good time. There's only the king guarding g5. I should look at 4 sequences of checks. It does look like I have enough. He's got no retreat back to g7 or f7. So h4 was the first thought, but then I thought maybe he could even come down and score a touchdown. So it's better to go knight at f3, cut off that square h4. May as well use the pin on the g file while it's there. So king h5 looks like mate in 2 with knight f4 check. King f5, then there's knight at h4. Alright, I think that was pretty convincing from start to finish, but it does help with that triple pawn gambit. I can afford to make a few mistakes and still be a lot of material ahead. Alright, scoreline is 5-1. Are we going to see another d4, d5? I can't remember. Xuanet might have asked for a minute or two break to go to the bathroom. Or you might be thinking, what random opening can I try that next time? A3, B4, C4. How can I entice Mugwort to play the Dutch? So the last d4, d5 game went surprisingly well for me. Even though I lost in the end, but I was quite happy with the opening after 10 or 12 moves. Just trying to remember how we got into that mess with where he castled queenside. Oh yeah, it was an early knight h5, queen h4 check. Right, so Xuanet will be back in a second. And I do get the feeling that he hasn't really had any games where he's been satisfied with the outcome of the opening, so that's why we're seeing slightly different move orders in every game. So I guess most people here would just play bishop f5 or bishop h5, but it's a subtlety to bring the bishop back to d7, because you might think, oh, when you play e6, it's a bit like playing a bad French. It's quite useful that the bishop is out of the way, because then you can go knight f6 with the idea of knight h5, and the bishop doesn't get in the way on h5. So yeah, I'm going for knight h5 as early as it's allowed. And there's a typical trick here where you can take twice on f4 and d4 and then go bishop at e3 check. I think I've done it in the wrong move order though. I think I should play knight takes d4 first. So the idea is to make a hole on e3 where you can stick the bishop back with check eventually, and you win back the piece. But typical to Xuanet's style, he's done a counter sack on h7, intending queen takes d4, I would assume. So he's making me think, but surely there's nothing better here than just rook takes h7. I mean, otherwise he's going to play pawn at g6 and he'll be the one attacking. So queen takes d4 expected. And here is where I don't have to do anything fancy. Just a simple move like bishop at c5 is very strong. So just gaining a tempo on the queen, pushing the queen back, and then looking for a way to proceed on the dark squares. Perhaps pawn at g3 or bishop at g5 or bishop to d6, using two bishops together on c5 and d6 with another one to keep off board. And this move is a little bit too fancy. I mean, it's okay. The idea is good to make a hole on h2, and of course there's a trick of takes bishop at h2 check, king f2, bishop takes g3, king takes g3 is unplayable due to queen h4 checkmate. So of course he's going to see this and perhaps just let me take on h2 and find a way to counterattack with pawn at g6 or knight at e5. And if I have the move, I wasn't even sure how likely it is to get a knight for g3 if he's hiding in the corner. Or maybe his intention is after h2 check to run out to safety via f2, e2, d1 and so on. And maybe bishop at f2 check is an option, because then, well, if rook takes f2, I can choose between g takes f2 check or g takes h2 check if I can pick up a knight quickly for g3, because that way king f1 can be answered by h1 equals queen. Alright, so he has given me the choice whether to play for gh2 check or bishop at f2 or bishop at c5, for example. But I think the best move here has not been mentioned yet. It's actually rook takes h2, because there's a very clever move. If he ignores it and attacks with pawn at g6, I can follow up with queen h4, just completely ignore the threat on f7, because then gf7 can be answered by king d8. So I would have vacated the square d8 for the king, and then threatening obvious checkmate with rook h1, which is extremely difficult to meet. And still other obvious ideas of playing bishop at f2 check and bishop at c5 to build up if needed. Yeah, so this move, bishop at f6, is mainly aimed at picking up a knight quickly in case I need it for g3. Not the most accurate move, allowing pawn at g6. So here I still have the advantage if I simply take on g6, and then I can replace f7 with a pawn quickly, because he doesn't have any easy way to pick up a pawn with a threat. So I do have time to take on g6, and then, yeah, if he takes back with either knight, then just pawn at f7 in response. Because if he sacks a knight on f7, there's no immediate follow-up. I don't have to take it back with the king. So again, f takes g6, last chance. I really should not allow g takes f7 check. It's a fatal mistake, because going either way is going to be painful. The point is now the white king is safe, and I had to focus more on defense and not allow him to pick up so many diagonal pieces for f7. So I have to stop bishop at f7, which means I really need to clear the square d8 for the king. So I think moving the queen is essential. Yeah, this check buys a bit of time, but it really is ineffectual. So yeah, move like queen e7 is necessary, but then he's coming in the other way, queen takes c7, and I still have to stop pawn at f7 check. So I think my play is forced. I have to play pawn at f7. So Xuanet continues very powerfully with, I think the move is pawn at d6. So deflecting the queen away from f7, that draws the king out into the open. He can then choose to trade queens if he wishes. And look how many knights he has defending the square e2. I have no counterattack. So it's too hard to come back from here. I've already missed my chances. Knight at d6 check, maybe even better. That's more forceful with the check. I have to come forwards out into the open. He's going to trade queens very soon, or maybe pawn at e5 check first. Yeah, either capture is bad. So he's taking the queen, and I can't even really take the rook on f1 because there'll be a queen at g4, king h6, and queen h5 mate. So the knight is needed to cover h5. And unfortunately, that means I have to play a defensive move. It looks a bit ridiculous to play pawn at f5 with the king out in the open. Again, I have to play a defensive move to stop queen at g6 mate. He can promote, he can do whatever he wants here. It's already lost. I'm just hoping he'll make a mistake with 10 seconds left, but no, queen h5 or queen takes h4, check. You can do this a number of ways. It should be made into. There we go. Alright, so nice attack after I allowed this g takes f7, which I really should never have done. It was a matter of counting carefully the diagonal pieces and realizing I could actually make a hole on f7 and then replace it with a pawn. Alright, this opening, I think it's called the Russian system against the 2 knights defense or 3 knights defense or something. A bit of a strange opening name on Lichess. But it's extremely rare to sack a pawn like this on e5. So I decided, okay, I'm not going to let him counterattack, I'm just going to sack first. Bishop c4 check is obvious. Now this is a lot better than the openings he's been playing in the last couple of games with the black pieces. So this is game 8. Yeah, so games 4 and 6 were he really gave me too much material. But this one, I've sacked a piece for 2 pawns. I think I should be castling. I mean, I can play moves like pawn at e3 again, but just a bit passive. One of the main factors here is that black, even if he chases the bishop away from c4, can still never castle because he's moved his king already, of course. So I think castling is correct. I don't want to bring the queen out early and allow knight d4. I don't really want to allow knight at h4 with tempo or any sack on f2. So I was expecting some move like d5, opening up the bishop on c8. Trying to play with as much vigor as possible in the counterattack. And knight e5 also a good move. I don't really want to retreat because I'm the one that sacked a piece. And of course there's a trick of knight at f3, so I'm just going to ignore the bishop for the moment and continue the attack. Yeah, with my facial expressions, I remember I thought I'd just completely wrecked this opening and it's gone badly, but it's not as bad as I thought during the actual game. It looks like I've just wasted a pawn there with missing the trick with knight at f3, but turns out to be okay. I mean, I can play pawn at f7 check, try and deflect one knight away from f3. If knight takes, then queen takes d4 becomes viable again. And if king f8, this gives me an invitation to keep dropping the pawn with pawn at h6 and try and bust him open that way. Could try and set up some way where I can regain just enough material to mate and allow him to take the queen, but I have to be careful, of course. I'm not sure what I was thinking about, but yeah, surely pawn at h6 is the only way to proceed here. Yeah, I mean bishop e3 perhaps, but just allows counterattack via pawn at f3 or pawn at h3. Alright, here we go. So he's played d5 to block out the bishop on c4. Trying to find a way to recapture on d4 with the queen. Wasn't quite sure what his response would be. Maybe just ignore everything and attack with pawn at h3. No, I mean, his idea is that he wants to defend backwards with the bishop. Maybe he's just missed this move that he doesn't have the trick because his knight on e5 is no longer on f3. And I have a huge threat to take either way on f6. So yeah, it was the fatal mistake of the game playing knight takes c4. I think I was doing okay anyway, but he was certainly in the game if he maybe just move the knight from f6 somewhere. Knight takes e4, for example. Yeah, so bishop takes f6. Anything can be answered by knight at h5 check, so that's why he's moved his king away. So I'm trying to provoke him to step onto the f6 square with the king. It doesn't matter too much, either knight check is okay. This one just vacates the square g5 for the bishop. And of course white has the first way to attack after king f6 bishop at g5 and trading queens. So I thought, yeah, you can't take on f6, maybe king g6 instead. You can't really afford to go backwards. So slightly low on time, but I think it's certainly enough time to win this position with the increment. Dropping the bishop on's useful to block out c8, trying to do as much as I can with check. He stepped back, so can I just pick up the knight on c4? It seems like all my pieces are covered now. I've actually come out of this a whole piece ahead, and he just doesn't have time to put his off-board pieces back on and recycle them because it's too late to start building a wall of pawns. This blocks out the bishop on c1, but I just save the knight. Knight g4 I think is good. So simple idea is to take the bishop on e5 or knight at h5 check to follow. Pawn at e7 also coming. It's way too hard to defend this. Pawn at f6 check also. Alright, so might as well just pick up the bishop. Main threat here is pawn at f6 check. Bishop f6 also. Yeah, and knight at h5 preserves another piece. Alright, too many threats. Queen at h5 or knight at f7, knight at g4. So, expecting a resignation. Okay, scoreline is 6-2. 2 games to go. So out of all my 5 opponents so far before this match, my only victory has been against Master 10, 6-4. Haven't had any bigger scorelines than 6-4, not in my favour anyway. I've lost 2-8 to Jasugi and 3-7 to Bugzilla. Lost 4-6 to Chicken Crossroad after leading 4-2. And had a 5-all draw with Penguin. So this time I'm going to be more careful with the move order. We've had this exact position in game number 7, where I started with knight takes f4. Still turned out okay, but this is much better to take on d4 first, as we are about to find out in the game. It doesn't matter which way he takes on d4, the response will be the same. Knight takes f4. And of course intending bishop at e3 check. So because he's thinking in the opening, I thought he'd try something again, like bishop takes h7. Just trying to create some sort of a target on the light squares, like g6 in the future. So again, nothing better than just simply recapturing with the rook. And so I've regained the piece, it's equal material, but I can pick up an extra pawn with bishop takes f4. I'm having a look at bishop takes d4, queen takes d4 to see if it goes anywhere. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with bishop takes d4, but much better, because this wins a free pawn, attacks h2. Of course, he doesn't want to defend with g3. It makes too many holes on the light squares, so I'm very happy to see knight at g3. First thought was to take, and if f takes bishop at e3, but again, the queen's covering the knight on d4. I think this is much better, queen h4. I think again he has to block with the knight, which is not so effective. Now that knight is effectively pinned on h3, so I don't have to worry about knight takes f4 at the moment. He doesn't seem to have any other threats, so I'm just going to build up slowly, try and triple the bishops. So we get an amusing position here with 4 bishops against 4 knights. Try and put as many bishops as I can on the dark squares. I can use the pawns as well. Pawn at e3 is, I think, the most incisive move, but yeah, nothing wrong with putting another bishop on the same diagonal. It's all about blasting through this diagonal with brute force. But as mentioned, very useful to undermine the defense of the knight with pawn at e3 before thinking about taking on g3. Yeah, so there's really no good response, because you can see he doesn't have a square to put a bishop to meet my bishops on dark squares. He doesn't have e1 anymore. So he sacked the rook. Yeah, might as well take the rook. That'll be useful for a later g1 after all these captures on g3. Take, take, take. I think he has to replace a pawn or a bishop on h2 or f2, and I'm just looking at what happens if I put a pawn on the other side, no matter where he takes. That does look good. So bishop at f2 should be answered by pawn at h2. Oh, now that I think of it, I wonder if rook h1, king takes, and rook takes h3 is any good. I mean, I suppose he can answer king back to g1 because he doesn't want to take. So perhaps that's not a forced mate after all, but look good just reviewing it now in the commentary. But yeah, because he doesn't want to allow a king h1, queen takes f2 with the idea knight takes f2, knight at g3 mate. The only other way is to allow a promotion. Now I could simply trade queens because I have a fake queen on h1, but decided to keep it on the board and just try and clean up as much material as I can. The knight on h3 is hanging. So it's going to be way too much material. See how safe that bishop on d7 keeps the black king. Yeah, there's just no way in to counterattack. So yeah, 2 pieces for a fake queen sounds like a pretty good deal to me. And the main idea next is to get rid of the knight on d4 and go queen takes f3 check. It should be an easy finish. So yeah, just knight at f5 and get rid of the knight on d4. It doesn't look like any way to defend the square f3. So it looks like game number 9, and the scoreline will be 7-2, 1 game remaining. So just a reminder again, this Crazyhouse Championship is about game points. So the more points you collect, every single game counts. It goes towards your total, and the eventual winner will take on the current champion Opperweisen in a 60-game match. So going back to a6, but this time b5. No gambits on d5 this time. So at the moment, at the time of recording, I think Chicken Crossroad is leading with 5 matches to go, but Jasugi99 is almost caught up, but he still has a match or 2 in hand. So it's looking like with 5 matches to go, Jasugi will be on top. I think, was it Bugzilla who's done the best so far with a scoreline of 2.5, 7.5? He's already had a 10-0 and a couple of 8-2s. Alright, this Queen E2 line is fairly safe. Well, it should be. So castling is okay. Didn't really want to allow any sort of tricks with knight takes d4. So I decided instead I want to move the bishop on c1. So the right move here is, well, either castle. It's okay to castle, but probably the safest move here is simply bishop f4. And that way there's no easy way that he can win 2 pawns for a piece. If knight takes d4, knight takes the knight on g4 is hanging. So bishop f4, but for some reason I play bishop g5. It's just a terrible blunder. And an immediate response, knight takes d4. Oops. So it turns out there's no sequence of captures that's any good for white, and already black has taken over the advantage. It's a free pawn and the compensation to black. Yeah, bishop takes c7 doesn't create a threat. You can just continue knight takes c3 in that case. Yeah, so probably the best is bishop takes e2 as played in the game, but I shouldn't spend a minute on bishop takes e2. There's nothing wrong with rook takes d8 in response and just being a pawn ahead. But xuanet is trying for even more with the move pawn at e3. I think because that takes a pawn away from a3, I think after pawn at e3 it's the right time to castle queenside. Because the rook on d1 is potentially useful. If he tries to get too greedy with e takes f2, there might be a rook sack on d7. But I'm also looking into preserving the bishop with bishop back to h4. So in this case, black has actually sacked a piece for a pawn, but he's mainly going for the initiative by taking on f2 and then replacing the pawn back on e3. Another interesting move is bishop takes f3, and then some idea to drop the queen on d2 would check. But after a long think, xuanet decided to take the pawn on f2, replace it on e3. I think also nothing wrong with knight takes f2, but anyway, this is quite strong. I think I really have no choice here. I have to evacuate with the king, so castling queenside I think is the only decent move. Queen at a1 check can just be answered by queen at b1. Now that black doesn't have any pieces in hand, this is actually favouring white to tuck the king away on b1. If it was my move, I'd even consider king b1. I think it's one of the best 2 or 3 moves in the position, king b1. Now the move I missed here, which was one of the last chances to stay in the game, was the rook takes d7, sack on d7. The rook, amazingly enough, is immune to capture because after king takes, rook d1 check is very powerful. Even though it looks like bishop at d5 is safe, knight takes d5 is actually crushing because bishop takes, rook takes, e takes, there's e6 check, and then knight at e5 check to follow. So rook takes d7 was the move. King b1 was maybe okay. And of course I have to face some serious fire on bishop at a3. B takes, bishop takes, and just hope to survive. Yeah, this move, pawn at d6, is just a little bit too slow because queen at b1 again was the move, but this way I'm gonna have to block with a knight, it seems. I mean, b2 is a horrendous weakness. If you can trade a couple of pawns for a3 and b2, or c3 and b2. Or even c3 and opening the bishop diagonal to hit a3. So I have absolutely no counterattack whatsoever. He can just feel free to pick off whatever pawn he likes. And I don't have any good response. So pawn at c3. Oh, there are so many moves. Bishop a3 even. I guess he's calculating the response. Queen at b8 check. If he doesn't have any blocker, so this is why he's taking a piece, so he always has a blocker. Now watch the smothered mate on e2 if he gets rid of the bishop. So I can't take the bishop back. I'm desperately sacking a queen. This move, pawn at c7, is just to deflect the bishop so the knight is not pinned. It's clearing the square d2. He can cut that off, but now I still have a defense rook d2. I'm not mated yet. But he's going to throw in a surprise move here, and that'll be the end because I flag. I can't take it. Yeah, just flags. Alright, so well done, xuanet, in the last game. 7-3. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next match.